So here sits my first AEG rifle ever, the Bolt B4 FS. Since its journey, it has gone through many modifications and upgrades. In this specific video, the one thing I had always wanted to do was change over the gearbox. The stock one is a non-quick change gearbox, which has kind of been phasing itself out. And when it comes to doing the tech work and upgrades to the gearbox, it's actually a very difficult task to both disassemble and reassemble. In this specific guy, the King's Arms, I thought it was going to be a pretty easy transition, and quite honestly it was a little more than I had bargained for, but nonetheless I was able to go through and make it happen. So here we'll go through the step-by-step things that I did and things that I ran into. As far as the gearbox in of itself, the housing and everything was quite sturdy and it looks great. I have no complaints there. Bearings were kind of difficult to put in, but this was my first time ever actually doing such things. So what I ended up having to do was get a hole punch of sort and take a hammer to it and pound them down in. Now there was a couple times I had to recheck them because they weren't fully seated, and it caused the gears to kind of bind up. So when you're doing these sort of things, just make sure that you keep double checking and triple checking those, because you can have issues. And the way I was able to find this is after I installed them, I just put each gear in one at a time, closed the gearbox up, and tried to free spin it. This was before even doing any shimming, so that's just a little tidbit there. Next, what I did is I took the safety latch from the stock gearbox to put into the King's Arms, and I had found that the main shaft, if you will, was too big for the opening for it to seat into, so I had to take a Dremel to it and kind of sand it down a little bit to get it to fit, because without that it was both just too tight, it wasn't free spinning at all, and also at the base of it, it was sitting too proud to where the selector plate couldn't properly activate it. From there I went through the shimmy process, which I actually had to use a lot of shims on this gearbox. It kind of made my head scratch on that, but compared to the stock gearbox I had to actually use more, so that was kind of concerning, but nonetheless I was able to successfully get all three of those gears shimmed in their proper place. From there I moved on to the installment of the gate aster, and on the I'll call it the back side of the gearbox, there's that little traditional bump that we all see when we're trying to put that sticker in. I opted this time to go ahead and take a Dremel to it and sand it right off before I put the sticker in. And with doing that, this gearbox had actually stuck pretty well. I'm not sure if it just didn't have the typical oils and grease like the other ones I've dealt with, but I was able to get that guy in there very easily. From here I moved on to the trigger install, and I noticed right away with this Krytac trigger two issues. And the first one was there's this little, I guess I'll call it a guide plate, if you will, for the sector gear on the back side of the gearbox that it kept bumping into. So I ended up having to take a Dremel to it and just slowly work away and chisel at it to the point where it finally was able to clear that. So that was issue number one. I went ahead and reassembled the gearbox with the aster and trigger and so forth, and I went to the software. I kept getting an error for the trigger sensitivity. It couldn't read all the 80 sensors as it was saying, so what was happening is the trigger couldn't fully go forward, and that's what led me to ultimately discover this bottom plate being the secondary issue and dremeling that. So from here I was able to get the selector plate off of the stock gearbox and put it onto the new one. It was a little bit of a pain having to bend it and whatnot, but it just took a little bit of time, but ultimately I was able to get that in there and slid fine. Moving from there was the next issue that I came across, and this was the piston. Now this piston itself I had taken out of the stock gearbox and put it into this one, the King's, but what I had noticed was that it was not freely moving on the inside when I had clamped the gearbox together. It was somewhere too big. So I had taken it out and I had tried a different one that I had on hand, which was this black one with the full rail. And that one slid in and out no issue whatsoever. So that led me to believe that maybe there was some type of size differential. So I got out my calibrator and I looked at the uh, red one that I wanted to put in and found it to be at the 21.39 millimeter width, and when I looked at the black one it was 21.14. What I ended up having to do is take my Dremel and just slowly sand away at the different rail guides until I was finally able to get it down to a size that would work. And once I got to there, I overshot it just a little bit, but it still was working fine. Got it down to 21.03, I think. And when I put it back in, slid in and out. For the most part, no issues. I did notice because of the rail being broken into 3 spots a couple times, it got kind of hung up in there, but it didn't seem like it would be an issue at the time. So I went ahead and rolled with it, got the whole gearbox assembled, and put in the upgraded spring that I wanted to use, which was this Lonex M120. And I got it all together, things seemed to be fine, and when I went to fire it, I got about, I think, 2 or 3 shots, and then it just bound right up, and I couldn't get it to fire. So I broke the gearbox down, took it apart, and looked, and upon opening it, I seen this little black chip, and I'm like, that's not normally there, that's not good. And sure enough, when I pulled that out and looked at the piston, it had actually broken the teeth on there. And in troubleshooting, what had happened was that the actual spring guide had caught up on the bottom of the bolt or piston itself, rather. It caught right on it and prevented it from moving further back, and thus with all the tension coming from the sector gear, something had to give, so the teeth on that broke. I was happy it was that, not my sector gear itself. So upon this test, I thought maybe there was a difference with the spring guides. Maybe one would work better than the other, so I tried all 3 of them, and each time, every single one of them locked right up. So I was able to cross that idea off. From there, I took the spring that I was trying to upgrade and compared it to the original stock spring out of the Bolt. And it wasn't significantly longer, but it was longer than the stock. So my thought was, well, if I cut down a coil or 2 to get it around the same length, that maybe that would allow it to not bind up. And that actually was not the solution. Even with cutting it down, it still would bind up and lock up every single time. So I scrapped that idea and I decided to try another spring that I had on hand. I had an M125, a different brand. I put that in and fired, no issues whatsoever. So for whatever reason, with the way this build went, it did not like that Lonex M120 spring. No clue why, but it just didn't like it. So I went with this 125 and moved on. From there, I did a couple test fires, tried to see if everything would go good, go smooth, and out of nowhere, I started having issues with the motor, where it was just trying to fire on its own, and it ended up actually costing me one of my batteries that overheated and almost caught on fire. During these tests, what was going on is I had noticed that the motor was engaged without me even pulling the trigger or anything. Once I had plugged the battery right in and put it in a semi, and I had taken the motor out of the housing and just held it in my hand, and when I had plugged the battery in, the motor was fine. And then when I would slowly push the motor into the gearbox, all of a sudden out of nowhere, the motor would try to turn itself. So led me to believe that there was a short inside the gearbox. I had to take the wires out, do a repair, and I decided at this point that I was going to try to make a little channel, so to speak, in the gearbox. So I took my Dremel to it, cut it down a bit as much as I thought was necessary, reinstalled it, and from there that issue was fixed. So in summary of the lower with that gearbox change, the couple issues that I ran into was just amazing. And when you're doing these, I don't want to call it a custom build, but when you're playing around with these kind of upgrades and changeovers, you're going to be dealing with quite a number of headaches. You might get lucky and might not, but I suspect that this isn't something that's abnormal to the process.